By morning, the storm had taken everything Ethan Cole had spent 3 years trying to build. Then Isabella Kane arrived with a check that could save it all.
I'll fund the entire library, 3 times the size you planned. One condition: you disappear completely from my daughter's lives. You'd really rather lose the house than take an offer that fixes everything you've lost?
It doesn't fix everything. It just moves the cost onto them instead of me. I'd rather lose every last thing I have than teach these girls that love comes with a price tag.
Isabella drove away, but for the first time what she felt wasn't victory. It was loss. His name was Ethan Cole, and until that Tuesday afternoon, nobody outside his small Colorado neighborhood had any reason to know it. "We're not looking for a father," the girl said. "We're looking for the best man in the world. Are you him?" Ethan Cole didn't move, not a muscle. Rain caught in his eyelashes, and the question just sat there in the doorway with him, too big for the porch, too big for a Tuesday. 3 seconds. That's all it took to knock a grown man sideways. It was the last Tuesday in March, the kind of gray Colorado afternoon where the drizzle can't decide if it wants to be rain or just an idea of rain, and the yellow shape of Bus 17 had just pulled away from the curb on Alpine Avenue, its brakes giving the same tired sigh they'd given every day for 6 years. Ethan had cut the engine, gathered his thermos and his clipboard, and was reaching for his own front door when the knock came. Small knuckles, but insistent, like a woodpecker that had made up its mind. He opened it to find 2 8-year-old girls standing on his welcome mat, hair the color of wheat gone dark, with rain jackets smeared with playground mud, eyes rimmed red from running the 6 blocks from Foothill Elementary without stopping once to catch their breath. Ava Kane stood in front, chin up, notebook clutched to her chest like a shield. Her sister Isla stood half a step behind, quieter, her gray-blue eyes doing all the talking her mouth wasn't ready to do yet.
"Are you him?"
Ava asked again, because apparently once wasn't enough for a question that size. Ethan set his thermos down on the porch rail slowly, the way you'd set down something breakable, and sank onto one knee right there on the wet welcome mat until his hazel eyes were level with hers. It was a small thing, kneeling. He didn't know yet that it was the kind of small thing a person spends their whole life circling back to. "Why don't you two come in and get warm first?" he said. "Then we'll figure out who I am." That was the whole answer. 2 girls, 1 open door, 1 man who still had yesterday's sawdust on his boots. The first thing he did once they were inside, before he even got their coats off, was reach for the route binder he kept by the door. Every driver's binder had one, laminated pages of names, addresses, and emergency contacts for every kid on the route. He found Kane, Ava, and Isla in his own tired handwriting and dialed the nanny's cell right there in the kitchen, the girls watching him with the solemn patience of children who already knew this part was coming. "They're safe," he said, simple and steady, before the nanny had even finished her first frantic sentence. "They're with me, Alpine Avenue. Come whenever you're able." Inside the house told its own story, if you knew how to read a room the way some people read a face. On the kitchen table sat a hand-drawn blueprint for a community library. Its margins crowded with pencil notes and coffee rings, 3 different erasers worn down to nubs beside it. Propped against the sugar bowl was a bank envelope, the paper the particular shade of red that never means good news. Loan denied. Final notice, stamped in block letters that didn't care whose dream they were crushing. On the windowsill, half hidden behind a jade plant that had seen better decades, stood a faded photograph of a 6-year-old boy with Ethan's same stubborn jaw. A boy who'd moved to Arizona with his mother 2 winters back and now spoke to his father mostly through a phone screen and a time zone. Beside the stove, crumpled and crumpled again, like Ethan couldn't decide whether to throw it away or frame it, sat a second envelope, a job offer. Warehouse manager. Triple his driver's pay with 1 line slashed through so hard the pen had nearly torn the paper. And on a nail by the back door hung a single brass key unlabeled to anyone but him. The spare to the North Boulder Community Center, where he taught woodworking to kids for free on Saturday mornings, whether anyone paid attention to that or not. Outside the kitchen window, Mrs. Rosa Delgado stood at her own fence with a garden hose forgotten in her hand, watering the same patch of gravel for a full minute, while she watched Ethan's front door, her round face pinched with the particular worry of a woman who notices everything and says nothing until it matters. Back on bus 17, still idling 2 streets over before its final loop to the depot, a spiral notebook lay open on the 3rd row, a student's forgotten in the scramble to catch 2 runaway sisters. One line was scrawled across the top in purple gel pen. Mr. Cole always waits for the last kid to get home. 40 minutes away and 28 floors up on 17th Street in downtown Denver, Isabella Kane sat at the head of a glass conference table, mid-sentence in a meeting that mattered to everyone in the room but her, when her phone lit up for the 4th time. She turned it face down. It buzzed again anyway. When she finally glanced at the screen, the nanny's message was short enough to stop her heart cold. The girls have been missing for 40 minutes. The boardroom kept talking. Isabella didn't hear a word of it. Her jaw went tight. Her gray-blue eyes, the same shade Isla had inherited from her, turned the color of a Colorado sky before a storm, and something old and cold rose up in her chest. Something that had nothing to do with quarterly numbers and everything to do with a fear she'd been outrunning since she was younger than her own girls were now. Back on Alpine Avenue, the porch light flickered once against the drizzle. "Come on in," Ethan said again, holding the door wide, "and get warm." The door closed behind them. The rain kept falling soft and steady on a house with a red envelope on the table and a mother 40 minutes away who had no idea her daughters had just knocked on the door of the one man who might change everything. What Isabella finds out next about the man on Alpine Avenue will turn her whole idea of protecting her daughters upside down. They came back the next day. And the day after that. Not for money. Not for gifts. Not even for the peanut butter crackers Ethan started keeping in a chipped mason jar by the door, the way you might keep dog treats for a stray that had decided your porch was safe. Ava and Isla Kane simply appeared most afternoons after the last bell, settling onto the wet wooden steps of the house on Alpine Avenue to talk about spelling tests and cafeteria drama and whether Mrs. Nguyen's class hamster was actually asleep or just faking it. Ethan kept driving bus 17. He kept waiting for the last kid to get off, rain or shine, the way he had for 6 years. But now there were 2 extra kids waiting for him at the end of the route instead. The porch swing, which had been creaking on the same rusted hinge since the house was built, became a kind of headquarters. Isla liked to swing it hard enough to make her stomach drop. Ava liked to sit dead still, feet tucked under her, and take notes. Ethan learned fast that the surest way to lose an argument with an 8-year-old was to try to win one, and the surest way to earn her trust was to just hand over the WD-40 and let her be the one to finally fix that hinge herself, even if it took her 4 tries and 1 skinned knuckle to get it right. She never told anyone what she found written in that notebook, not for weeks. It happened on a Thursday. Ava left her spiral notebook behind on the 3rd row of the bus, the same one with the purple gel pen scrawl on top. Ethan almost didn't open it. Almost. But something about the way she'd left it, squared neatly on the seat like she meant for it to be found, made his hand pause on the cover. The first page stopped him cold. A list 100 names long, each one numbered in a careful 8-year-old hand. And at the very top, at number 1, written in dark blue ink and underlined twice, Ethan Cole. Beneath it, a note. Knows how to listen. Never checks the clock when kids are talking. He sat there on his own front steps for a long time, after that notebook open on his knee, not sure whether to laugh or to put his head in his hands. 40 minutes south, Isabella Kane wasn't laughing at all. A folder had landed on her desk. The kind of folder a woman builds when worry curdles into something closer to control. Photographs. Ethan on his knees in a stranger's driveway fixing a bicycle chain for free. Ethan at the hardware store on Broadway, counting out cash from a worn leather wallet for lumber he clearly couldn't spare. The house itself, small, weathered, a porch light that flickered, a roof that needed work he hadn't gotten around to. Isabella studied each photo the way she studied a hostile takeover, looking for the seam, the angle, the thing a man like that had to be hiding. "Nobody's that good," she said out loud alone in her car, without wanting something. What she didn't yet understand was that her own fear of being fooled was about to fool her worse than any stranger ever could. The call came 2 days later, and it undid her faster than any boardroom ever had. The nanny, again apologetic, rushed, explaining that she'd only stepped inside for a moment to grab the girls' jackets when she heard Ava out on the porch, laughing about something and calling, clear as a bell through the open line, "Dad, wait, you have to hear this one." Isabella heard every word of it through the car's speakerphone. 11 seconds of silence followed. She counted them, without meaning to, the way you count contractions, the way you count anything you're bracing yourself against. Then she ended the call, set the phone down with exaggerated care, and let her palm come down once, softly against the steering wheel. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud. It was the first time in longer than she could remember that Isabella Kane had let herself lose control of anything at all, even for a second. Back on Alpine Avenue, Ethan's own trouble had a return address. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Red envelope, again, the bank's final answer stamped across the top in the same unforgiving block letters, "Loan denied." No exceptions, no appeal. He sat on the porch steps in a light rain that afternoon, with the library blueprint spread across his knees. And when the wind kicked up and scattered the pages across the wet grass, he didn't chase them. He just watched them go. That's when the girls showed up, right on schedule. They didn't ask what was wrong. They didn't say a word, in fact, just started gathering the soaked pages from the grass, smoothing them flat against their jackets, stacking them neatly on the step beside him, the way you'd tend to something you understood was precious, even if nobody explained why. He never told them what that gesture meant to him. He didn't have the words for it yet. Isabella, meanwhile, had made a decision that surprised even her. She showed up at the North Boulder Community Center the following Saturday in old jeans and a borrowed apron, hair scraped back a name tag that said "Volunteer" stuck crookedly to her chest. Unrecognizable to a man who'd only ever seen her, if he'd seen her at all, in tailored blazers and heels that clicked like a countdown. She watched him from across the room as he knelt beside a boy sanding down a birdhouse patient as Sunday. She watched a company recruiter walk in mid-morning, the same warehouse management offer Ethan had let sit crumpled by his stove for 2 weeks, never quite thrown away, never quite signed. The recruiter had come in person this time, tired of waiting on a mailed answer, holding out a pen along with the papers. She watched Ethan glance down at the same triple pay offer he'd already half torn through once at his own kitchen counter, glance up at the room full of kids, elbow deep in sawdust and glue, and hand the pen back without using it. "They need someone here more," he said. Simple as that, and went right back to steadying the boy's sandpaper. Something in Isabella's chest shifted, though. She wasn't ready to name it yet. Later that same afternoon, she found herself sitting cross-legged on the community center's scuffed wood floor, her manicure ruined, glue drying stiff on her fingers, listening to a small girl who wasn't hers explain in complete seriousness why the dark under her bed felt different from the dark in the hallway. Isabella listened. Really listened. The way you listen when nothing is being pitched to you, when there's no deal on the table, when a child's fear is simply a fact you're being trusted with. She realized, sitting there, that she couldn't remember the last time she'd sat on a floor with her own daughters like that. Not once in longer than she wanted to admit. That single afternoon on a splintery wood floor would end up changing more than she ever expected it to. She didn't stay for the closing announcements. She peeled off her name tag in the community center parking lot, sat in her car with the engine still off, and studied her own reflection in the rearview mirror for a long moment. A woman she barely recognized, glue on her fingers, doubt in her eyes. "I'm going to end this," she told the mirror, "before it's too late." She meant it as a promise to protect her girls. She had no idea yet how wrong she was about what needed protecting. What Isabella does next will bring her face to face with the one man she swore was hiding something. Team Ethan or Team Isabella? A hardworking bus driver who never asked for anything? Or a mother trying to protect her girls from a stranger she doesn't understand yet? Drop your team in the comments before you keep watching. The knock that night sounded nothing like the girl's knock. It was hard, deliberate. The kind of knock that already knows what it thinks of you before you've even opened the door. Ethan opened it anyway. Isabella Kane stood on his porch in the thin, cold rain. No disguise this time, no borrowed apron, no crooked name tag. She was back in her armor, black blazer, sharp enough to cut hair, pulled tight gray-blue eyes gone the color of river ice. Behind her, headlights from her car threw long shadows across the wet grass. She'd made one phone call before she'd ever gotten in that car, to a district transportation supervisor she knew socially from a school board fundraiser, asking in the careful language of a woman used to getting things moving quietly, whether someone might look into the appropriateness of a bus driver's after-hours relationship with two of his former students. She hadn't waited for an answer before driving straight to Alpine Avenue herself. Some habits control, chief among them, didn't know how to sit still and wait. "I know what you're doing with my daughters," she said, and her voice didn't shake at all, though something underneath it did. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize a man like you? Using a child's trust to climb into a life that isn't yours?" She had rehearsed that line the whole drive over. It still didn't come out the way she meant it to. Ethan stood in the doorway and let it land. It found the exact place she couldn't have known was already bruised, not good enough, not ambitious enough, not the kind of man worth staying for. He'd heard some version of those words before, years back, in a kitchen that wasn't this one, from a wife who'd wanted a bigger house and a bigger title and had eventually settled for a smaller husband in her rearview mirror. He hadn't fought her on it. He'd never known how to argue for his own worth out loud, only how to prove it quietly, in the small, unglamorous ways nobody put on a resume, waiting for the last kid on the bus, fixing what was broken, showing up again the next day. Isabella's words landed on top of all of that, patient as weather, and found they still fit. His face went pale under the porch light. His hand tightened once around the doorframe, and that was the only sign he gave that she'd hit anything at all. "I looked into you myself," Isabella went on, and now the shake in her voice was harder to hide. "The house you can't afford to fix, the loan you can't get, a little boy in Arizona who barely calls you back. And somehow you have time, endless time, for two little girls who aren't even yours. Tell me how that adds up, Mr. Cole. Tell me what a man like you actually wants out of all this." "I don't want anything from them," Ethan said quietly. It was the first thing he'd managed to say since she'd started talking, and it came out rougher than he meant it to. "I never asked them for—" He didn't get the chance to finish. The door behind him flew open wider. Ava had been standing just inside it the whole time, close enough to hear every word, and now she pushed past Ethan onto the porch, her voice cracking wide open. "Mom, don't say that, Dad! Ethan never asked us for a single thing, not once, not ever!" Isla came right behind her sister, crying now too, her small hand fisting into the sleeve of Ethan's flannel shirt like she meant to physically hold him in place. For the first time in either of their 8 years, the twins stood in front of an outsider and pushed back against their own mother together without hesitation. Isabella froze. Whatever she'd come to say next simply evaporated. Ethan lowered himself down to one knee, the exact same pose, the exact same angle as the day the girls had first shown up on his porch asking if he was the best man in the world. He looked at each of them in turn, his voice low but steady enough to cut through the rain. "Go home with your mom," he said. "Don't lose her because of me. Not ever. You hear me?" Neither girl moved for a moment. Then slowly, achingly, they let go, first Isla's fist unclenching from his sleeve, then Ava stepping back beside her mother, both of them soaked through and shaking, not from the cold. Isabella herded her daughters toward the car without another word to Ethan. She got behind the wheel. She didn't start the engine. She sat there instead, in the dark hands still on the wheel at 10 and 2, like she'd been taught in some driver's ed class decades ago, and let herself do something she hadn't done in front of another living soul in longer than she could count. She cried. Not composed tears, not the kind she allowed herself in private moments between meetings. This was the old fear, finally breaking the surface. The fear of a little girl who'd once watched someone she loved walk out a door and never explain why. A fear she had spent 20 years converting into control, into spreadsheets, into locked doors and background checks, because control, unlike people, never left you standing on a porch in the rain. Somewhere underneath the anger at Ethan was the much older, much rawer fear that she was about to lose her daughters to exactly the kind of quiet, steady love she had never let herself believe in. The girls sat silent in the back seat the whole ride home, Isla's hand finding Ava's in the dark. Morning came gray and unkind. Ethan was still nursing his first cup of coffee, black, same chipped blue mug he'd used for 11 years, the handle held on now mostly by stubbornness and superglue, when his phone buzzed with an email from the school district's transportation office. He read it twice to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding. Due to concerns raised regarding your relationship with the Kane family, we are requesting a meeting to clarify appropriate boundaries between district staff and students outside of school hours. Effective immediately, your continued assignment to Route 17 will be under review pending that meeting. He set the phone face down on the counter the same way Isabella had the day before, though neither of them would ever know they'd made the exact same gesture 40 minutes apart. Through the kitchen window, he could see Mrs. Delgado already out at her fence line, despite the weather watering can in hand, not watering anything at all, just watching his house the way she had the very first afternoon the girls showed up, her round face creased with the quiet worry of a woman who'd buried a husband and raised 3 kids alone, and knew exactly what it looked like when a good man's whole world started coming apart at the seams. She didn't come over. She just stood there, present, the way good neighbors do when there's nothing useful left to say. Route 17 had been his for 6 years. 6 years of 5 a.m. alarms and squeaking brakes and kids who called him Mr. Cole in September and something warmer by May. He read the district's email a third time, looking for a loophole that wasn't there, and understood, with the particular clarity that only bad news brings, that a single knock on his door back in March had already put everything he'd built quietly at risk. The letter he wasn't expecting had already been written before the ink on hers had even dried. Outside, the rain hadn't let up. 200 yards away, in the back seat of a car idling at a red light on Broadway, Ava pressed her forehead to the cold window and watched the world blur past in gray streaks. She could just make out, for one last block, the porch light still burning on Alpine Avenue. "Did we ruin everything?" she whispered so quiet her sister almost missed it. Isla didn't answer right away. She just reached over and laced her fingers through her sister's, the way she always did when there wasn't a good answer to give. Up front, Isabella caught the whisper in the rearview mirror and said nothing at all. Because for the first time in longer than she could admit, she didn't have an answer either. Back on Alpine Avenue, Ethan stood alone in his kitchen, with the library blueprint spread across the table in front of him, its edges still curling slightly from the rain it had weathered days before. Beside it sat the district's email, printed out now, the words already starting to blur where a drop of coffee had landed too close to the page. He looked at both of them for a long moment, the dream and the warning, side by side on the same worn table, and said the only thing that felt true. "I'm doing it again," he murmured to no one, to the empty kitchen, to the 6-year-old boy's photograph still propped against the windowsill. "Making everything fall apart." Neither Ethan nor Isabella could see it yet, but the worst was still coming, and it would take everything from both of them before it gave anything back. The very next night, the rain that fell on Boulder wasn't the ordinary kind. It came down off the Flatirons in sheets, swelling every creek and drainage ditch between the foothills and Broadway, until Boulder Creek ran high and brown and fast the way it hadn't since the flood years locals still talked about at the hardware store. By morning, the lumber Ethan had bought with the very last of his savings, every board, every beam meant for the community library, had washed clean off the tarp behind his house and scattered somewhere downstream. The North Boulder Community Center fared no better. Water crept in under its back door overnight and pooled ankle-deep across the very floor where kids had knelt sanding birdhouses just days before. By 9 that morning, a hand-lettered sign hung on the glass door. "Closed until further notice." Ethan stood in his backyard at first light, in his boots and yesterday's flannel, watching brown water swirl around the empty tarp where 3 years of careful saving had been stacked neat as a promise the night before. He didn't say anything. He just stood there a long time, the way a man stands at a graveside while the last of the runoff carried splintered 2x4s past the fence line and out of sight toward the creek path. Nobody could have guessed the water would take more than just the wood. The email arrived within the hour, as if the district had simply been waiting for one more reason. Given the ongoing public attention surrounding your relationship with the Kane family, your assignment to Route 17 is suspended, effective immediately, pending formal review. You are asked not to contact district students outside of official duties during this time. Ethan read it standing ankle-deep in mud, surrounded by what was left of a dream that had taken him 3 years to save for and 1 flood to erase. By midday, a dozen kids who normally spent their Saturday mornings elbow-deep in sawdust at the community center were left standing outside a locked door instead, noses pressed to the glass, staring at ankle-deep water pooled across the same floor where Isabella herself had once sat cross-legged, listening to a little girl talk about the dark. One small boy, the same one whose birdhouse Ethan had helped sand just days before, asked his mother more than once when Mr. Cole was going to fix it. Nobody had an answer for him yet. That's where the girls found him. Isla arrived first, and the sight of the wrecked lumber pile broke something open in her that had clearly been building for days. "It's all our fault," she said, her voice cracking wide open, tears cutting clean tracks down a face already wet with rain. "If we hadn't knocked on your door that day, none of this would have happened. You wouldn't have lost everything. We won't come back anymore. We promise." Ava stood beside her sister, trying so hard to hold herself together, the way she always tried to chin up, shoulders squared, and failing anyway. "We just wanted a dad," she said, barely above a whisper. "And we ruined his whole life instead." Ethan went down on both knees in the mud, no hesitation this time, and pulled both girls into his arms at once. For the first time since the day they'd first knocked on his door, he had no steady words ready. Nothing wise, nothing gentle enough to fix what was breaking in front of him. He just held on. Somewhere underneath the mud and the ruined lumber and the suspension letter folded wet in his back pocket, an old fear was surfacing in him too. The fear that he was, after all, exactly the kind of man who made people he loved pay a price for loving him. His son's face flashed behind his eyes. A boy who now lived 1,000 miles away. Partly Ethan still believed, on his worst nights, because his father hadn't been enough to make anyone stay. He wanted more than anything to tell these 2 girls that none of this was their fault. That a good man doesn't calculate the cost of showing up, but some quiet, wounded part of him was busy doing exactly that math anyway, weighing what he'd already lost against what loving them might still take from him and finding, even now, that he couldn't make himself regret a single afternoon of it. He was still on his knees in the mud, one girl under each arm, when Isabella's car pulled up along the flooded curb. She already knew about the flood. She'd already seen the suspension notice word traveled fast in a town this size, and faster still when a CEO had reason to be watching closely. She stepped out into the rain without an umbrella, without her usual armor fully intact, and made him an offer with a voice that shook even as it tried to command. "I'll fund the library," she said. 3 times the size you were planning. Every board, every book. A real building instead of whatever this was going to be. 1 condition. She swallowed hard before she said the rest. "You disappear completely from my daughter's personal lives. No calls, no visits, no more showing up at the end of a bus route like you belong there." For a moment, nobody spoke. Rain filled the silence where words should have been. "You'd really rather lose the house," Isabella pressed, quieter now, almost pleading beneath the command in her voice, "than take an offer that fixes everything you've lost?" "It doesn't fix everything," Ethan said. "It just moves the cost onto them instead of me." Ethan looked down at the 2 girls still trembling against him, soaked through, watching him with the particular terror children get when they think the ground beneath them is about to move again. Then he looked back up at Isabella. He shook his head, slow and certain, his voice hoarse, but steady enough to carry over the rain. "I'd rather lose every last thing I have," he said, "than teach these girls that love comes with a price tag." The consequence landed immediately, and it landed harder than anything before it. The library was as good as dead. Ethan's steadiest paycheck was gone with it. The girls, convinced now more than ever that their presence had cost this man everything he owned, pulled back from him entirely, retreating into the car without another word, without so much as a glance back toward the porch that had become, in a few short weeks, something like a second home. Isabella turned the car around in the rain and drove away. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something closer to loss than victory. The unfamiliar, unwelcome sense that, in trying to protect her daughters, she might be the one finally driving them away from her. Word of the flood moved through the neighborhood the way it always did on Alpine Avenue, fast, quiet, and mostly through the kind of women who noticed things over fence lines. By early afternoon, Mrs. Delgado had already called 2 other mothers from the community center's parent list, though she didn't yet know what exactly she meant to do with what she'd heard. She only knew a good man was standing alone in the mud, and that wasn't something her generation had ever been taught to just walk past. What none of them could see yet was that the story wasn't ending here. It was only about to turn. Ethan stood alone afterward among the ruined lumber rain still falling steady around him, the suspension letter gone soft and pulpy in his back pocket, the library blueprint on the porch table smeared now past reading. He looked at both of them for a long, quiet moment, the wreckage of a dream and the proof he'd lost his income in the same week, and said, to no one at all, the same 6 words he'd said once before, only heavier this time. "I'm falling apart again," he whispered. The screen might as well have gone dark right there. It felt for a moment like the kind of ending where nothing more good was coming a man alone in the mud, a family torn apart by the very kindness that was supposed to bring them together. A story that had promised healing and delivered ruin instead. But somewhere between the flood and the silence that followed, something was already stirring on Alpine Avenue that none of them had seen coming yet. 3 days passed in almost total silence. Ethan didn't leave the house except to check the mail, and even that he did quickly, like a man avoiding eye contact with his own front yard. The girls didn't come. No porch swing creaking, no notebook left behind on purpose, no peanut butter crackers disappearing from the mason jar by the door. 40 minutes south, Isabella locked herself inside her glass office on 17th Street and canceled every meeting on her calendar for the first time in the 8 years she'd run Summit Grid, telling her assistant only that she wasn't to be disturbed. The porch swing sat still. Even the wind seemed to have given it a rest. Ethan caught himself more than once listening for small footsteps on the front walk before he remembered there weren't going to be any, and each time the silence landed a little heavier than the last. He ate standing up at the counter those 3 days, out of the same chipped blue mug he used for coffee, because sitting down at a table meant for company felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. Nobody who knew either of them expected the silence to break the way it did. It broke on the 4th morning, and it broke loud. Mrs. Delgado arrived first, right at 8, with 27 people behind her parents from the community center. 2 of Ethan's old teachers from Boulder High, a handful of kids who'd once sanded birdhouses under his patient hands. They came with fresh lumber stacked in truck beds, cans of paint still rattling, secondhand books boxed up from someone's garage, every tool a North Boulder garage could produce between them and a single poster board, edges already curling in the morning damp covered, corner to corner in signatures. Across the top, in thick marker, "We stand with the man who always waited for the last kid to get home." Nobody asked Ethan if he wanted help. They simply started building right there on the empty lot beside his house, hammers going before he'd even finished his coffee. One of the old teachers, a retired shop instructor, who still called every student champ, whether they were 8 or 80, took one look at Ethan's ruined blueprint drying on the porch rail and declared it salvageable with nothing but a straight edge and some patience. He stood at the window and watched it happen. Watched neighbors he'd waved to for years, but never really known step onto his lot like it belonged to all of them now. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't have it in him to refuse. She never expected a stranger's offhand comment to be the thing that finally cracked her open. Isabella had driven past twice already that morning, slow, unnoticed, parked a block down, where she could watch without being watched. It was there, leaning against her own car, that one of the mothers, not recognizing her, just making conversation while waiting for more nails, mentioned that Ethan had once turned down a job paying triple his salary just to stay close to the neighborhood kids. Isabella already knew that. She'd watched it happen with her own eyes at the community center weeks earlier, but hearing it now, secondhand from a stranger who had no idea who she was talking to, landed differently. It confirmed something she'd been circling for days and hadn't let herself land on. Her phone buzzed before she could decide what to do with that feeling. One text from Ava. No emoji. No punctuation at all. You always said you'd do anything for us. So why did you take away the person we need most? Isabella read it once. Then again. She sat parked outside the half-built library for a full 40 seconds without moving, without crying, without doing any of the things she might have expected herself to do. Then she took off her blazer, folded it over the passenger seat, pulled her hair down out of its clip, and walked over to Mrs. Delgado. "Can I borrow a hammer?" she said. It wasn't a question exactly. It came out closer to a confession. She didn't apologize out loud that day, not once, and later she would wonder if anyone had even noticed that she hadn't. But something in her had finally understood what all her research and background checks had never let her see clearly. That she'd spent years mistaking control for love, building walls she called protection around two girls who only ever wanted someone to sit on the floor with them. Picking up that hammer wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was the first honest thing she'd done in this whole story that wasn't about managing an outcome. She worked through the afternoon without saying much of anything, and neither did Ethan. They carried lumber past each other on the same narrow path a dozen times. They painted opposite walls of the same small room close enough to hear each other's brushstrokes saying nothing at all about anything that mattered. Because some things, it turned out, didn't need saying. Yet they just needed doing, side by side, until the doing became its own kind of apology. By late afternoon, the frame of the new library stood against the Flatiron's raw wood, gleaming gold in the slanting Colorado light. Paint fumes mixing with the smell of wet earth, drying out at last. Kids ran laughing between stacked boards. Mrs. Delgado handed out lemonade from a cooler that had clearly seen every church picnic in the neighborhood for the last 20 years. What neither of them said out loud that afternoon would end up mattering more than anything they could have planned to say. When the last truck pulled away and the last child had been called home for supper, only two people were left standing beside the pile of leftover lumber, the fresh paint smell still hanging thick in the evening air. Ethan and Isabella stood a few feet apart, not touching, not talking, watching the light go gold and then gray over the mountains they'd both grown up looking at from opposite ends of the same small city. Neither of them said a word about tomorrow. Neither of them needed to, not yet. They just stood there together in the quiet, two people who had spent an entire story trying to protect the people they loved by keeping everyone else at arm's length, finally close enough to hear each other breathe. What happens next in front of the whole neighborhood would be the one thing neither of them ever expected to hear out loud. Opening day for the North Boulder Community Library arrived under a sky so clear it looked freshly rinsed. The whole neighborhood turned out. Kids chased each other around the new bike rack. Mrs. Delgado had brought 2 apple pies and a folding table because in her mind, no Colorado gathering was complete without both. Ethan stood near the front steps in the same flannel shirt he always wore, sleeves rolled, hands a little rough from 3 weeks of sanding and painting. Isabella stood near the back of the crowd, not hidden this time, not disguised, just present. The careful distance she used to keep from everyone finally gone from her posture. Ethan had called his son in Arizona that morning. First time in months he'd managed it without checking the clock first to see if it was a convenient hour. They hadn't talked long. It hadn't needed to be long, just a boy's voice on the other end saying he was proud of his dad's library, and a father standing in his own kitchen with his throat too tight to answer right away. Some doors Ethan was learning didn't close forever just because they'd been left open too long. Nobody in that crowd had any idea what the girls were about to do next. Just as the applause for the ribbon cutting was dying down, Ava and Isla stepped up to the small microphone someone had set up for the mayor's assistant without asking anyone's permission first. Ava held it with both hands, the way she held on to most things that mattered to her. "We once made a list of 100 men," she said, her voice carrying clean across the quiet crowd. "But today we only need to ask one of them a question." Both girls turned to face Ethan. "Will you be our dad?" 5 full seconds of silence followed, the kind that feels much longer when 100 people are holding their breath at once. Ethan looked at the girls first, then found Isabella's eyes across the crowd. She gave the smallest nod, barely a movement at all, but it was the first time in this entire story that she had let go of every ounce of control in front of anyone watching. Something in Ethan settled in that moment that had been unsettled since a kitchen years ago and a boy who now lived 1,000 miles away. He'd spent so long believing that showing up quietly was the only kind of love he had any right to offer, never the kind you said out loud in front of a crowd. But looking at these 2 girls, and then at the woman who'd finally stopped keeping score, he understood there was nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose by simply telling the truth. He went down on one knee, the same angle as the very first day, on his own front porch, and spoke loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. "Only if your mother lets me be her partner first." Isabella walked forward through the parting crowd. No announcement, no speech, she simply crossed to where he knelt and rested her hand on his shoulder, right there in front of the whole neighborhood, without a trace of fear left in it. The girls ran and folded themselves into both of them at once. Behind them, the library doors stood open, afternoon light pouring gold across the new shelves. Somewhere behind them, Mrs. Delgado was already cutting the first apple pie, telling anyone who'd listen that she'd always known from the very first afternoon she watched 2 soaked little girls knock on that door in the rain. The porch swing back home would keep creaking on its same rusted hinge for years to come, and the bus on Route 17 would keep waiting every afternoon for the last kid to make it home. Some things in that small Colorado neighborhood would change forever after that day. Plenty of others, the good ones, would simply carry on exactly as they always had. Nobody needed to prove anything else after that. They only needed to stay. This story reminds us that the best father, the best partner, the best neighbor is rarely the one with the most to offer. It's the one who simply stays and listens. If there's someone in your life you've quietly kept at arm's length out of fear, this week is the week to close that gap by an inch, not with a speech, but with your hands. Invite them to sit at your kitchen table on Sunday afternoon, set out 2 cups from the good china your mother left you, and ask one honest question. Then let them finish answering before you say a single word back. If you're the one who's been standing at the edge of things, waiting to be asked in, know that showing up quietly again and again counts for more than any grand gesture ever could. Keep a small notebook by your door, the way Ava did, and write down one kind thing you noticed someone do today. Not for them, just for yourself, so the good doesn't slip past unnoticed the way it so often does. And if you're a mother, a grandmother, a widow, who spent years being the one who holds everything together, let this be your gentle permission to put the hammer down and ask for help once in a while. Call the neighbor you've been meaning to call. Bring the extra pie to the porch instead of the freezer. Love, real love, was never meant to be earned or proven. It was only ever meant to be received. And the moment we stop trying so hard to be enough is usually the exact moment we finally are.